Welcome to the Power Players by Origis, featuring solar and energy storage leaders and their critical thinking to deliver the clean energy promise. My name is Cynthia Khatib. I welcome you to this episode hosted by Michael Eyman, Managing Director of Origis Services.
Okay, today on Power Players, we've got Richard Matsui, CEO and founder of Kilowatt Hour Analytics. Richard has been involved in solar for quite some time, going back to his times with McKinsey, and then founded, I think you founded KWH in 2012. And since that time have really been focused as the CEO and founder on, site performance, insurance, funding, and really how to optimize sort of the front end of these things. And so, today we're going to talk to Richard a little bit about how to connect site performance and how you invest in both from a CapEx side on the front end and your OpEx side on the back end with your O&M operators and asset management strategies, because how you maintain a plant is going to have a direct impact on how it operates and how much power it delivers. So, Richard, welcome to Power Players.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
About yourself and tell us a little bit about KWH.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing is that even as I'm looking at you at this camera, there's a window right behind you for me. And at least that window for me is of beautiful Honolulu. So I'm out here in Hawaii, which is where I was born and raised. And so perhaps on a personal note, one of the things you learn very quickly in Hawaii is that, especially when I was growing up, that nearly 100% of our energy, our power requirements, were coming off of burning diesel oil, which is two things. One, from an environmental, from a climate standpoint, obviously not the ideal solution. But second of all, is that when you have crises, such as a hurricane coming through or a global oil shortage, like these become things that are more than inconveniences for those of us who live on the island. Like this becomes what's going to happen to our hospitals, what's going to happen to life here if this dependence on fossil fuels is not resolved. So I think from a personal standpoint, I think that there's been a early recognition that this is an important solution to an important problem. Always one of the first states that could recognize the importance of putting a statewide target on achieving a certain level of renewable adoption, and been glad to see that the rest of the country has followed suit rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense on top of having to import all the sources of power from the mainland. Hawaii has an abundance of sun and wind and natural resources, so it makes sense to use those, right? And it seems like, and on top of it, at the time, and I think still today, the highest grid rates in the country. So coming from that viewpoint, it makes total sense how you would end up in McKinsey and sort of get into solar and then be pushing that way. So tell me a little bit about KWH Analytics and sort of where do you guys focus in the marketplace?
Sure. Like we are building out what we think of as the insurer for the energy transition, which means that we provide the industry with both information on how to better manage these risks and also tools like financial products that can be used to mitigate risk appropriately. And so I think, at least particularly for this conversation here, we're probably best known for what we do on the data side of things, which is where we have data from about 30% of the solar power plants here in the United States that we're collating the information from, using that insight to then drive results around or drive insights with regards to asset performance, but also, of course, being able to provide products that better fit those problems that are emerging in the data.
No, that makes sense. And you guys issue, I mean, you don't just do this, as part of, your commercial operations, right? You also issue some annual reports. In particular, the solar risk assessment. You just put that out in 2021, I think last month. You guys call it SRA 21, right? And it's broken down into three sort of critical areas, right? The first is about the risk around the financial modeling, and then you guys get into sort of operational risks. And then finally, you sort of talked about extreme weather, which has been something that people have talked about a lot. And I think there was like 14 different subtopics that you had underneath those three segments with 10 different, sort of partners that were all experts in the industry that were sort of weighing in with their viewpoint. Thinking about the connection between production, an asset's value what it produces, and then how to really optimize it from a cost perspective, where to make good investments, where those investments can really impact. Like, what things came out of SRA 21 that perhaps people should be going back and taking a look at and thinking about?
Yeah. So I think this year's SRA had a number of really interesting points to them. So maybe I'll describe the philosophy for a bit, and then let me describe some of the getting
Sure.
back to your questions. So at least the philosophy of the report.
Yeah, it's your show.
Yeah.
You want to tell me?
So at least the philosophy of it, and as you know, is that this industry is both very young and has been around for at least a decade plus now. And so because befitting a relatively young industry, there's a lot of a qualitative perspective around what's happening in the field, right? And that the challenge is that there's a lot of conflicting narratives about what's actually happening with regards to these assets and how they're performing in the field. And so our belief here is like, look, it's great that everyone's got a different perspective, right? I think that, of course, like an O&M provider will be able to see things that literally happen in the field. A panel manufacturer will be able to see what happens in terms of both in terms of their manufacturing lines, but also with regards to like the return policies. An IE is going to get to see a different part. The asset owner is going to get to see a different part, right? But like each one of these firms is going to be looking at these assets with a very specific viewpoint, but one that's a bit hard to actually appreciate all the other viewpoints in there. But once you can start pulling those different viewpoints, you can start to get some very interesting conclusions about what's actually happening to us as an asset class. And so the thinking was two things. One is like, let's make sure we have that diversity of viewpoints, because that will drive the real insight. But the second is to require that everyone contribute like one key statistic into this that the industry may not know today. And so by doing so, we make sure that this discussion is very much centered on facts rather than opinions, and of course, moving the industry forward. So that's the philosophy involved there. And I think to your point, having Woodmac involved, having D&B involved, like having some pretty sizable firms involved, of course, will just help to build out that industry dialogue. So that's where we came from. In terms of where some of these takeaways come into the market, I would say some of the things are less new, and then some things that are newer. So one thing that we did find was that the investors are now seeing, whenever they invest in a solar power plant, there's about a 1 in 8 chance that these assets will be a chronic underachiever, is what we call them. So meaning that they will be underperforming even their P99 downside scenario over a multi-year period. Which, of course, the P99 is in the finance world believed to be the this will never happen kind of scenario. When you see that they're happening 10 times more frequently than that this should never happen scenario is, suddenly starts to call into question what is we as an industry believe to be possible versus not possible. So I think that's perhaps like the single biggest thread, and of course there's been a number of others. We can tack back to those in a second. And of course the number one question we received from this report was, okay, given that there's so much underperformance happening out there, what should we believe to be the right solution? Is it the fact that the industry is overestimating energy production, or is it actually the case that the assets themselves are underperforming? And to some extent, these two views are absolutely two sides of the same coin, right? Like overestimating or underproduction, it's the same thing.
Well, they're measured against each other. So if one or the other is wrong, you're going to see both sides, right? I mean, when you say when asset owners say sites are underperforming, they don't mean from what it can do from a physical perspective. They mean from their model, right? That's
exactly.
They're measuring against. So they're kind of, I don't even know if they're two sides of the same coin. I think they're different views of one side of the coin, from my perspective.
And that's absolutely true, right? But I do think that the reason why I even mentioned this, right, because it is the same thing, so fully agree. But the reason why I bring it up is that if you believe that these assets are overestimated, the solution set that you start thinking about is, okay, how do I stop someone from doing irradiance shopping, when they're flipping me an asset? How do I think about which IEs I'm selecting, right? Like there's a certain set of solutions that you might think about when it comes to overestimation. If you believe that the core problem is actually underperformance, you start thinking about a completely different set of issues, right? You start thinking about what is the warranty setup, when I buy this asset, for the inverters? Which O&M partner am I working with? How am I funding my O&M reserves? And there's a different set of questions I think you think about if you believe that the core problem is underperformance. But I agree with you, it is the same thing.
Well, it's always been interesting to me too, because, and I think you see this as well, although if you don't, tell me, but owners, long-term owners, don't do a good job of discriminating between high quality assets and sort of average or even low quality assets, right? They and I'm not sure if it's a lack of data or if it's a lack of focus or they just don't know how. But that's the case. So if you're on the developer side of things, right, and you're building assets, what is the return on the investment to investing more capex and more of your money on the front end to make sure that that asset is really of high quality when you're going to get the same price at sale no matter what, right? Your goal is to put as little money into it as possible to optimize your return. And so there's this disconnect. I mean, how can, sort of speaking on the upstream side, not the operations side, but the upstream side of things, how can the industry or owners shift their mentality so that they can identify when assets are better, i.e., they're not going to be that 1 in 8, they'll be, there'll be 2 in 8 that perform or whatever it is above that P99. How do they identify those? And then when they do, are they worth more and should they be paying a little bit more for those?
Yeah, and I think the answer is it's got to be yes, right? I mean, if we as an industry are trying to build a real industry, we can't be in this mindset of, well, I'm going to do this thing and flip to the next guy, and I just hope that it's going to work out for them. And that's not the attitude I think we collectively would be ascribing to or aspiring to. It's just, it happens to be that there's a number of profit pressures that kind of push the industry more in that direction. If I were to describe at least our view on like solutions to this, we think it's transparency. Like we think that there's not a single LP or GP that goes into a transaction saying, I'm going to buy this terrible asset and I'm just going to fool myself into thinking it's a great deal, right? Like, but there's concerns, and there's concerns that can't really be quantified because there's historically been a lack of transparency. And so one of the tools that we provide at least is just straight up data. So if you're looking to acquire a solar farm in a given area that's using a certain type of hardware in a certain type of location, we have data from 20 other projects in that area that look quite similar. And so therefore being able to at least provide the data points to enable an investor to be clear-eyed with regards to like, here's the areas where someone might be conservative, here's someone might be aggressive, and at least putting some facts to what's otherwise a very kind of conversation.
Yeah. Do you see that actually happening at some point in the future? That those valuations will become more fact-based and sort of contemplate how these sites are made, what they're made of, how they're constructed, and therefore understand how to characterize that performance more accurately down the line?
Yeah, we've been working with a number of financial institutions on exactly that question because there's no financial institution that wants to do a bad deal, right? Like I said, and I think that when we look at any mature asset class, there's always some ability to look at market comps. In fact, for most asset classes, that is the dominant way that someone's going to look at valuation in particular. They're looking at comps. We don't think solar is going to be any different on a long-term basis.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It from the operations side of things, sort of shifting to now the site's built and it's constructed and how it was built and what it was built with and how it was modeled, that's all set, right? The operator doesn't have an opinion or weigh in on those upstream activities. So now you're in the operations mode. Your site's not performing the way you thought it would. Where should owners focus when they're thinking about how to sort of deal with that? And because I think the same mentality applies. I get it all the time where we'll be competing in the marketplace with another company on the O&M side, and an owner will just say, well, I got this other quote here that's lower than yours. What are you going to do about it? And the scopes are vastly different, right? The amount of work, the obligations, really, really different. But the owners don't understand the differences between those. They just see a number, right? And so that question of, do you invest in that higher number and does that have an outcome, I think is a valid question to address.
Absolutely. And this is where we have a view, but because we are one of those multiple perspectives, like I would very much like to hear what your take on this. You've been operating these assets for a number of years now. At least what we're saying is that there's a fair amount of overestimation going on in this market, right? So that's fully true. But to your point, okay, take that aside. Now you've already got the operating asset. Now what? And so what I think about is next is what Radian Gen was describing, that when they look at the percentage of tickets, they do this beautiful pie chart of just here's where all the tickets are coming from, and then also looking at the lost energy, as a result of that. Like unsurprisingly, like the number one culprit was coming out to be on the inverter side, right?
No.
And
No.
No, yeah, exactly, exactly. But the guy told me that this thing that always works, right? So that's I think that's clearly where a lot of the industry attention needs to fall is how we think about both like the servicing and on the upfront warranty provisioning of that.
Mhm.
But the problem I think that we all have structured in the industry is that as you know, I mean, every year or two, there's some large manufacturer that's going to declare bankruptcy, right? We don't know which one it is, especially not 10 years ahead of time. But this is just a fact of a really rapidly growing space like ours. And so, Suntech was the biggest, they went out of business. Yingli was the biggest, they went to bankruptcy. On the inverter side, I mean, you also can kind of go down the list of the number of firms that was around, but then they're not around anymore. So even like the best laid plans from an upfront diligence standpoint don't necessarily pan out. When it comes down to 4 years later, you've got your SATCON inverters, and it's like, look, you can't really figure out where to get the replacement parts for anymore. So that's where it starts getting a bit out of my expertise zone, and I'd love to hear more about your view on that question as well.
Well, I think inverters and sort of how to, de-risk that decision is probably an entire podcast series all by itself.
Sure.
Broadly speaking, I would say that, even when I was at SunPower and I was running procurement there for inverters specifically before, really dealing with them in the field operationally, they, again, there was a strong emphasis on price, and there probably wasn't an understanding of the complexities of the different architectures and what that meant as far as the failure rates. And in addition, there was sort of this bias that big companies with big financial backing were lower risk. And yet, time and time again, some of the biggest companies in our industry, and I'm talking about companies like Eaton, ABB, Schneider, General Electric.
Naming names, Mike, I like it.
Like these are
yeah, keep going.
These are big names of companies that that know their stuff and make good equipment. And in almost all of the cases of every name that I mentioned, one exception only did it one time, have been in and out of the market multiple times with different products. And they've never gone bankrupt, but they have exited the market when they found out those products weren't performing profitably for them as a company, which means that those assets, regardless of the financial viability of the company, were stranded. They were stranded assets that you then had to figure out how to support long term. And inevitably, the cost of that support, when the supply chain shut down and the parts shut down and everything, goes up, right? And it's not contemplated when you've got these large assets that are 20 or 30-year assets. It's one of the arguments, really, for string inverters, where you can sort of pull them off and swap them out with much more facility and ease and at a much lower cost, and not have to go through sort of large scale redesign and rebuild. But again, that's, and then of course there's, extracting response times, extracting performance, and uptime guarantees and availability guarantees, and making sure that the contracts have teeth, that they've got technicians that can provide the response time, that they've got, parts that are pre-positioned in the geographic area so that you can get decent, response. And so there's a number of things that all happen. And again, these are all upstream activities. These are things that the developer and the owners and the EPCs negotiate sometimes years in advance of operations, right? And then it gets to the operator and you get a contract with no response times, no availability guarantees, no teeth to hold the inverter manufacturers to actually respond in what we would consider a timely manner. And the owners look at us and say, well, what are you going to do? And my short answer is, well, I'm going to follow the contract and the warranty, because if I don't and I violate your warranty and your warranty gets voided, then now I'm accountable, right? And I can't do that, but you didn't negotiate a good enough contract up front for me to really have leverage on this situation. So that's sort of the high level where a lot of that core issue is. But to your point, understanding where you have the most failure rates and understanding how to invest in against those failure rates to try to mitigate them years in advance by maybe paying a little more for the right inverter, or an inverter that has a lower failure rate, or maybe paying a little more for a longer warranty, or consolidating your demand so that you can extract more obligations, will pay off big time in the long run. But what do you guys see, again, trying to connect that performance and cost perspective? Where do you guys see those as really viable and valuable investments to make? Or are there other areas? Like, how do you invest for performance, both during operations and upstream?
Absolutely. And I think that going back to this idea of the transparency point, that really what our industry has is a bit of a problem with price discovery, right? I mean, I think to your point, everyone knows what cost is, but the value is actually a lot harder to understand, right? Yeah. And that one insight just explains so much of individual behavior that you see across our entire value chain. And so one of the things that we think that we provide, through this data is that, as an example, if we are being asked to provide insurance for a certain solar power plant that's using hardware that, according to the data set of 300,000 plus facilities, we see that the performance of that hardware is not very good. Like, unsurprisingly, we do what any insurance company would do for that, right? Like, that's going to be more expensive to insure. Just like how if you have your teenage son who wants to start driving, all of a sudden, like, look, statistically speaking, like, you see that that's going to be risky behavior. The insurance industry does have the ability to price that in, and as a result, is able to help guide behavior. But in the absence of that kind of feedback loop of someone with the data then put a price signal on that, it's actually pretty difficult for someone to know, is this good, is this bad? How should I think about this? I can see a cost, but I can't really see the value. And what insurance does, and anything in any part of finance, is about trying to look forward and be able to pull forward the insights from that data to a price that's here today. And as a result, enabling people to make better decisions. And so when our clients start seeing that certain hardware manufacturers start to have a higher insurance premium associated with them, like, that's going to be a feedback loop that can help them to make better decisions next time around. We're one of many of these feedback loops, though, right? I'm sure that when you speak with your clients, I'm sure they ask you, hey, Mike, what do you think about inverter X or panel Y? And that ability for you to tell them, like, look, if you're going to give me inverter X, we're happy to do it, but look, here's the kind of downstream cost that we're going to see associated with that. Like, that's exactly the sort of transparency the industry needs.
Yeah, I think the challenge we have is inverter in particular, but really trackers, all of your DC infrastructure, everything. Those products turn over every few years. So by the time you have enough data to provide a good, answer, they're on to the next product, and sort of it's overcome by events, as we used to say in the military. So, that's part of the challenge. You do see trends with certain manufacturers based on their broad approach to the design of their equipment, but it's hard to do. And insurance companies, for their part, going through that insurance process with brokers out to the big guys to underwrite things, and that's a very opaque process from a consumer or business perspective. And so, how are the insurance companies getting better information? Are they properly handicapping or pricing the risk around specific architectures? I haven't seen evidence of that to date. I hope that's coming, because I think that would move the needle for the industry and start to shape behaviors a little better. But you're in that. You tell me, where are things going there?
I wish I could disagree with you, Mike. So, by and large, that's exactly right. I think that the insurers that have been operating in the renewable space, historically speaking, are not experts at renewables. I mean, one way I think about it is, think back to SPI, which I know we all have to clear out the memory cells a little bit. Like, last time we were at SPI, right? Last time we were at SPI, or name your solar conference, what insurance person did you run into, and do they know this space, right? And like, most of the time, I don't run into anyone else for insurance in our industry. And second is that when you do run into them, there's the level of questions they're asking tend to be a bit more superficial about the industry, right? Like, we don't have a deep bench of true industry experts operating in the insurance world. Should we be surprised, therefore, that when innovation comes down the pipe or something happens in our industry, that they are the first to bolt? Because they didn't really understand the space that well to begin with, and so therefore they can be blindsided. So one of the things that we hope to be able to do is that by using the power of this data to bring in more of that insurance capacity, to be able to show to the insurance industry, look, this is understandable. One can build reliable actuarial tables on this risk. That's something that's historically been missing.
Yeah. So how are you guys going to play in that space going forward? I know that that's one of your areas of focus. I mean, but I don't know that you provide brokerage services or anything like that. So, like, how are you guys going to push this along? I think you and I have been talking about this subject just personally, I think for years now, truthfully, on and off. So how do you see KWH Analytics and you as the CEO and founder sort of pushing this forward?
I think to me, two things. Like, one is that, as you know, we do have that solar revenue put product already. And so, of course, being able to continue to hedge or guarantee a certain level of energy output and course, revenue streams from these solar farms. And we'll continue to do that. We've already crossed the $3 billion mark of solar projects insured, and I do expect that to continue. With regards to the second point, though, I think that where the industry attention is really come to spotlight in the last couple of quarters is really on property insurance rates, which have, as chronicled in the solar risk assessment, I think Lockton showed that there's a 20 to 30% year-on-year increase in cost of that, which, as we all know, like solar is not the sort of industry where you can have any line item in that pro forma go up by 20 to 30% for several years on end without there being some pretty serious implications.
Yeah.
And so in the second half of this year, we'll be bringing to market a property insurance product as well. And we'll also be able to, brokers as well as their clients be able to use to help mitigate that issue.
I'd like to talk to you about that because, as an operator, on the operator side, our contracts typically escalate anywhere from 2 to 3% per year. So when you have a large line item that's going up 20, 30%, and the owner's sort of response is, well, sorry, that's your problem, right? I mean, that's, because they're dealing with their own cost escalations on the owner side, right? And to your point, when 10 years of contract escalation gets absorbed by 1 year of increase in insurance, that's not good. Right? That's a bad situation. And that's where we find ourselves today. So I look forward to that product. You need to let me know when you guys start to offer it. But, talking about the energy put a little bit, you and I first sort of discussed this, I think 5 years ago, right? It's been a while and you guys have taken it to market. It's been great. And, it's always been my view that the correct place for performance guarantees is really via an insurance product where the owner owns that, and because you're literally insuring your production, right? You're insuring the financial performance of the site, and the vast majority of the inputs that go into controlling that performance are made upstream by the owner and by everybody else. Whereas the operators, we can control how quick we get to things, how fast we grab a part off the shelf and resolve it, but we can't control how long it takes the part to get here when it's coming from overseas. We can't control warranty partners who don't have any obligations to respond in a timely manner. We certainly don't control the weather or how the site was built or how it was modeled, which is what we're being measured against. And so performance guarantees at the operator's level have never really made a lot of sense. Back in the day with SunPower, when you and I first talked about this, and with First Solar and others, where they were building it and everything else, and so that it sort of made sense from that perspective, and it was their equipment. That's just not really the case today with anybody anymore. No one does that any longer. And so if owners want to ensure their performance, they really need to reach out to somebody like you guys, understand the inputs to those performance, mitigate against them, and then take out their own product that they can sort of hedge against that performance with. So that's been my view for quite a long time. But I'm curious as to whether or not, one, you still see it the same way, and how the market is seeing it.
Well, one is that, yeah, I fully agree in that one could see that there's going to be a natural evolution of the industry. I mean, to your point, right? SunPower back 10 years ago was a very vertically integrated firm. If there was going to be one firm that should feel comfortable putting their stamp of approval and saying, I will guarantee this whole thing, it should be SunPower, right? And so I think that made a lot of sense that this is where the industry started. Obviously, there's been a tremendous amount of fragmentation as the industry has grown, but also there's been so many specialists that have come through, right? The idea of someone who's going to do panel manufacturing all the way through to, develop EPC O&M, I don't think any of us really see an immediate return to that kind of model, not given how competitive each one of those value points have become. And so, we do think that it's natural for an industry to also start specializing, that someone with a lot of data can start stepping in with certain levels of guarantees to make these transactions more easily done. But I guess, just giving your lens on the industry, what is true though is that the O&M it plays a very significant role, right? It's true that, look, you might not be the one that negotiated the inverter contract. It's true that you don't control the weather, right? There are a number of things you don't control, but the things that you do control are very significant. And so I know there's been at least a 5-year long, dialogue that we've had about, is the industry going to move to a point where there is less of a, here's the bare minimum I need to get done from an asset owner standpoint, and do that and then try to get as much as I can from Mike. But at the end of the day, if he tells me this other stuff's going to cost me more, forget it. Is there a point where that's going to change in our market? And if so, what's going to force that kind of change?
Yeah, it's interesting. People will buy vehicles, right? And they'll maintain those vehicles and they sort of understand, look, if I do the bare minimum or as little as possible on the maintenance or none at all, my vehicle's not going to last as long. But we'll spend $500 million on a solar asset and not understand that same basic premise, right? So it's hopefully that this podcast, along with a lot of others, will start to drive some of that stuff home. So look, we're getting close to the end. So, top 3 things from your perspective owners can do to sort of invest in the performance of their sites.
Oof.
I should have given it earlier. I know you're always hard, off the cuff. So I'm just going to babble for a second while you think about your response. Talk about something else. Like, that's a really nice shirt. In any case, top 3. What do you think?
All right. So it's a great question. And I'm going to go with one is like, know what you're stepping into, right? Like, it's your point. Like, these are 10 years ago, I think if you're an investor in our space, before you're buying an asset, you have some valid excuses why you may not be able to cover all the bases here. But look, we now have more than $100 billion worth of cumulative investment made just in this country into operating solar power plants, right? Like, there's a fair amount of experience that we now have. And so there shouldn't be an excuse for missing on some pretty elementary things in that diligence process. So knowing what you're stepping into. 2 would be, I think to your point, there's a number of contracts that are disproportionately important for the performance of the asset. And of course, this discussion on inverters, I think was really timely on that front. And then the third is perhaps to try to keep an open mind here. Like, I know that our industry is we're so trapped into this thinking around, like, if I'm an investor, I need to win this next asset. There's like 20 other guys who are bidding alongside me. Therefore, I have to assume X, Y, and Z things, which are, a little bit crazy, but, there's a certain mentality that has really set into our industry here. And I think that we, as an industry, need to take that step back and think through, is this what you want your name associated with for the next 10 years? Because if you're an investor, that's implicitly what you're doing. Like, this is your track record that you're building here. It's a tough discussion because I think we can both appreciate the factors and forces pushing the other side. But I do think bad decisions will come home to roost is the question of when.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I think the trend to date has been, the push from investors and owners is they have a ton of capital sitting on the sidelines that they have to deploy. And if they don't deploy that capital, they're not going to keep their job. But if they deploy the capital through a process and then later on something doesn't work out, their job is fine. And so, I think and I'm not trying to disparage anyone. I just think you have these dislocations, in the market where the value that we're paying for things and the reasons why we're paying for things are maybe not aligned to, really the facts of these assets long term, as you say. And so I'm hoping, truthfully, I hope every day that we get to a point where, facts drive, what happens. Good projects, mean higher prices, better return, and lower quality projects are known for what they are. But I don't think we're quite there yet today. And if you do find yourself out there with a project that's a problem set, you're going to have to spend a little money with a quality O&M provider to do the right thing to get it as good as it can be, as it sits, not as it's modeled, but as it actually sits on the ground and in reality. And I think that's the key. So, at least from my perspective. So, final thoughts?
Yeah, Mike, I mean, what changes this in our industry? I mean, like, we have been on this track as an industry for a long time. It gets every year we all say to ourselves, it couldn't possibly continue another year in this direction. And I think we've all been surprised that, even as we're getting to this point now where these, you can have these chronic underperformers be like, 10 times more frequent than people would think. Like, we thought that a year or two ago, even when that number was lower, that there was already going to be a bit of an inflection point. But we've been proven wrong so far. Like, what changes in our industry here?
Yeah, I don't know, Richard. I mean, and I don't want to end this on a doom and gloom, but I don't know. I wonder that too every year. I will say, as an industry, what we're doing matters. It's changing the world in very, very real ways, and we can all be very proud. Everyone, everywhere in this industry can be very proud about what we're doing, but that doesn't mean that we can't do it better. and we can't do it smarter, and we can't be more honest and more critical of ourselves, and continue to move our industry and really this planet and our, the countries that we live in and reside in and do business in forward in a positive way, by really being thoughtful about how we do it. So, I do want to end by sort of saying, we all are working on, we're all doing work that's truly worth doing. But let's work on doing it a little bit better, maybe. So, look, Richard, it's been great talking to you. Thank you for your time. CEO, founder, pretty smart guy on top of it, and a true power player, Richard Matsui. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
Take care.
Find summary thoughts on this topic and more insights into operating your clean energy assets at origisservices.com. Thank you for listening to this episode of Power Players by Origis, critical thinking to deliver the clean energy promise.